Make up mine. Fight.
Team Fortress 2, as a game, has a tumultuous relationship with the concept of knockback. Between Pyro's air blast, Soldier and Demo Man's explosives, and virtually every weapon in the game being capable of hitting people around, the TF2 community is well acquainted with being bounced around like beach balls in the average player versus player match. Because of this, you'd probably think that TF2 doesn't have much of a need for dedicated special case weapons that feature knockback as a core part of their designs, but you'd be wrong. TF2 actually has exactly 3 weapons with dedicated knockback mechanics, and they range in reception from gimmicky novelties to widely hated so-called crutches. In this video, I want to talk about them. Please note that we're not discussing literally every weapon in the game capable of inducing knockback or CC, as again, that's virtually every weapon in the game, and are instead focusing on ones that have knockback featured as one of their advertised stats in their tooltip. That said, let's roll. Before we begin though, I'd like to note that this video is brought to you by Raid Shadow Legends. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Isn't Raid Shadow Legends that one mobile game that sponsors every YouTuber? Well, yes, but it's also much more than that. I thought for a while, and I'm sure you did too, that Raid was just another flash-in-the-pan, pay-to-win time waster, but after giving it an earnest try, I'm happy to report that I was very incorrect. Raid Shadow Legends is a content-rich, in-depth console-level experience available in the palm of your hand. It's very easy to get sucked in and let hours slip away as you take on raid bosses, fight in the PvP arena, perform dungeon runs, or anything else that suits your fancy. Between the over 800 champions leading to seemingly infinite champion combinations and breathtaking presentation, Raid is a game that consistently impresses and proves itself as a powerhouse not just in the mobile space, but in the gaming space as a whole. If you sign up using either the link in the description or the QR code on screen, you'll not only receive a hefty starter pack to set your Raid journey off on the right foot, but you'll also receive the boss killer champion Juliana once you reach level 15. Again, I had skepticism about Raid, but after trying it, I was left both impressed and pleasantly surprised. It really is a very fun experience. If you want to try it out, use the link in the description or the QR code on screen. Thanks again to Raid Shadow Legends, and on to the video. Ah yeah, you know we had to start here. If there's one TF2 weapon that's synonymous with the concept of knockback, it would definitely be Scout's Force of Nature. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if some people watching this video thought this was the only one of these in the game. Regardless, the Force of Nature is an iconic weapon within Scout's lineup. Not only was it added all the way back in 2009 Scout update, making it one of the oldest unlockable weapons in the game, but its name also references what's arguably Scout's most iconic quote. I think you'd have a hard time finding someone who outwardly hates the Force of Nature and its unique knockback mechanics, either on the using it or fighting against its sides. Even famous curmudgeon Great Blue came around on it while actively working on a section of a video about why he disliked it. Everything's coming up Force of Nature, but why is that? Let's find out. The Force of Nature is an unlockable primary weapon for the Scout, a double-barrel sawed-off shotgun not unlike the Soda Popper. It only loads a maximum of 2 shots at a time compared to stock 6, and features a lengthy reload between clips. On top of this, it also features a flat 10% damage penalty. Has a few aspects to compensate, this weapon fires significantly faster than stock, allowing it to dump both of its shots in rapid succession into a single target, and it features more pellets per shot, which, should they all connect, actually offsets its per shot damage penalty. Most importantly though, it deals knockback with each shot. This knockback is contingent on the Scout's position when the shot is fired, with enemy shot being blasted further away the closer they are to the Scout, and the Scout being knocked backward should he fire it in the air. This enables some very fun and cheeky third jump tech, and augments the Scout's already potent mobility even further. Right off the bat, we have something important to note here. It's a very often echoed sentiment in the TF2 community that, despite the Force of Nature having a damage penalty, the 20% extra pellets per shot actually mitigates this and causes it to deal more damage. This is
technically correct. The best kind of correct.
But not entirely true in practice. If every pellet from a Force of Nature shot connects, then it does indeed deal a higher per shot damage than stock, but this will only ever happen in the first shot on point blank range, especially on servers with random bullet spread enabled, and the weapon's small clip size and slow reload speed actually result in a significantly lower DPS than stock. While it does technically deal more damage than stock if the stars align, this will not happen every time you fire it. As a result, this weapon noticeably struggles in sustained battles or dealing with larger numbers of enemies. Against tanky classes or groups of enemies that can't reliably be dropped with your 2 allotted shots, you're left pretty naked using the Force of Nature. It doesn't have the rapid damage output or flexibility of a lot of Scout's other primary options, and does not flourish in every game state. As a purely combat-oriented, damage-dealing, kill-securing primary, this weapon pales in comparison to stock and its cousin weapon, the Soda Popper. Sounds pretty rough, right? Well, not really, because despite all of this, I actually really like the Force of Nature, and it's entirely due to the namesake of this video and its primary mechanic. The Force of Nature's Knockback is one of the most weapon-defining singular stats in the game. This is one of those stats that changes your entire class's playstyle on its own, rather than just being a simple number adjustment. It's also really goddamn fun. At a base, the Knockback blasts enemies away based on where they are relevant to the Scout when they're shot, so if they're right up against you, they'll go flying, and if they're far away, they'll barely be affected. This makes hefty hit-and-run attacks against key targets entirely viable and effective. Rushing in, blasting someone to a different area code, while also dealing over 100 damage in their HP, and using the space you've put between you and them to either beat a hasty retreat or clean them up. It's incredibly disorienting to be blasted by this thing, and an opportunistic Scout player will always capitalize on that. In addition, this weapon flourishes not on the front lines, but on the flank. If you run into a Force of Nature Scout on the flank and you're by yourself, then you're in a pretty bad position, as if the Scout can connect his shots, then he controls the pace and flow of the battle. You can't rightly try to secure an advantageous position or control neutral when the Scout is capable of instantly displacing you with a well-placed meat shot. It's the Scout who gets to decide where the battle begins and ends, so long as he can land that first shot. This weapon is pretty uncommon and casual, so it's entirely possible to be thrown for a crushing loop when you eventually do get hit by it. It does less damage for sure, but is also far from a dedicated utility weapon, and is still very capable of facilitating some very aggressive play. And we haven't even talked about mobility yet, which might just be the strongest thing about this weapon. By looking down or behind you and firing a shot with the Force of Nature while in midair, you can perform what's essentially a third jump. And this isn't some unintended bit of Source Engine movement jank like shrimping. This is an explicitly intended aspect of this weapon's design. Scout literally has voice lines for it. But yeah, would you believe that giving the most mobile class in the game immediate risk-free access to even more mobility is kind of insane? With the third jump, Scout becomes adept at clearing huge distances and reaching places that even he's not supposed to, and when combined with this weapon's power on the flank, can make him a real menace. Plus, this weapon's knockback also allows players to take advantage of their environment to secure some cheeky kill confirms. Not only is it totally possible and very funny to launch enemies to their deaths on maps with pits or hazards, shoutouts to Upward, but you can also really effectively secure kills by blasting enemies into walls to anchor them in place for a crushing, unavoidable follow-up. It's a pretty common criticism of the Force of Nature that the knockback frequently pushes enemies out of your effective double tap range, but with smart positioning and use of your environment, there are ways around it. I honestly really appreciate how intuitive and simple to grasp this weapon's concept is. Like, when you hear shotgun that does knockback, the Force of Nature does pretty much everything you'd expect it to. I can understand why a weapon like this was added in Scout's first significant update, as it's a really genius and intuitive design that functions exactly how you'd want. I'm sure Valve was really excited to get this thing pushed out. So between added mobility, advanced tech, ability to displace enemies on command, ability to control the pace of 1v1s, and all-around utility for both aggressive and strategic play, I'd consider the Force of Nature's knockback to be one of the most layered singular mechanics in TF2, and one that handily grants its host weapon a ton of merit. While I know the opening of this Force of Nature segment skewed a bit negative, that was only me discussing it before the knockback had been put into play, because once you add it to the discussion, the scales are decisively tipped in this weapon's favor. It's a very fun weapon that rewards experimentation in spades. I'm never gonna argue that it's meta, best in slot, or even anything much more than a fun gimmick, but I'll be damned, it's a very fun gimmick. It's not a weapon that I bust out often, but one that I frequently do get the itch to try out and push some folks around with. While it may just seem like a fringe novelty, this weapon is honestly one of Scout's more interesting and layered primaries, and opens up so many avenues for a player who knows how to capitalize on its unique strengths. It might be a bit gimmicky, but there's a reason that this weapon earned its name.
Grass grows, birds fly, sun shines, and brother, I hurt people.
Loose cannon cop who doesn't play by the rules.
From a very intuitive and simple weapon to one of the most loaded designs in the entire game, the loose cannon. Yes, this weapon does deal knockback and does feature it as one of its primary mechanics. This weapon is also one that some people fucking love. Like, this thing is right up there with the Beggar's Bazooka as a weapon that some TF2 players basically center their entire personalities around using. It's inarguably a cult classic weapon, yet not unlike the Force of Nature, it's also definitely a bit gimmicky, so we're gonna try and let's suss out exactly what makes this bomb tick. Let's dive in. The loose cannon is an unlockable primary weapon for Demo Man. A large cartoonish pirate ship cannon, this weapon fires equally large cartoonish cannonballs that, unlike Demo Man's other grenades, do not explode on impact with an enemy. Rather, an enemy hit with a loose cannonball will receive 50 damage and a hefty bit of knockback, with the ball exploding on its own after a second. The Demo Man can hold M1 to run down the bomb's fuse while it's still chambered before firing, allowing him to time the explosion and maximize damage. Should a player hit an enemy with both the ball itself and the explosion within a half second of each other, they'll be rewarded with a unique double donk mechanic, at which a loud sound effect will play and a unique particle effect will appear, with the enemy suffering a guaranteed mini crit. The damage of both the direct hit and the mini crit explosion combined is actually enough to one-shot light classes from full health, and this combined with the weapon's knockback can allow for some very cheeky kill confirms. Now, that's the weapon's baseline stats and mechanics, but it's worth noting that the loose cannon is also a particularly misleading weapon. Not buggy, though that reload animation could definitely use some work, but just misleading. Its stats mention that its cannonballs travel 20% faster than stock, but due to TF2's projectile physics and the large cannonball model, it actually travels noticeably slower in practice. In addition, the cannonballs share their projectile hitbox with the much smaller stock grenades, making the effective area to actually hit enemies much tinier than the cannonball model would lead you to believe. So basically, the cannonball model is like me in my day-to-day, in that it inadvertently causes a ton of problems by just existing. Because of this, there's about 5 or 6 necessary skill checks to even begin using the loose cannon. You need to understand its mechanics, you need to know about its unique technical quirks, you need to be able to land pills at a base, you need to also be able to adjust to landing cannonballs specifically, you need to be able to time the fuse to maximize damage, you need to be able to gauge the perfect distance between you and your enemy to secure a double donk, and you need to be able to follow up on that double donk to secure kills on non-light classes. This weapon asks a lot of the player to even begin grasping it at a base foundational level. I can kind of understand why so many people seem to have formed a cult around this weapon. I'd probably never shut up about it if I got good at it too. But yeah, the loose cannon is not an easy weapon to get to grips with. Luckily, it pays off that significant learning and adaptation curve with some of the most fun and satisfying feedback in the game. I'm not gonna pretend this weapon is amazing. It consistently outputs less DPS with a bigger skill floor and investment than stock, but that's not what the loose cannon is about, man. This is a bona fide fun out of 10 weapon. The kind where you don't care if it's suboptimal or non-meta because it's just so goddamn fun. Remember when I made fun of the Righteous Bison and said that a weapon needed to be either good or fun at a base to be worth using? Well, this is the weapon I was thinking about when I said that. The loose cannon is a weapon that trades the consistent reliability of 100 damage pipes for a playstyle that features dizzying highs, terrifying lows, and creamy middles. It'll definitely be rough at first, as you miss every cannonball you fire out and only secure the occasional kill when an enemy walks into one of your bombs, but when everything clicks and you start securing double donk after double donk, nothing can match it. Valve knew what they were doing, giving this weapon a unique sound and particle effect for successful donks. They know how to get a guy hooked. Combine that with a very fun knockback mechanic and a surprisingly versatile fuse charging ability, and you've got a recipe for one fun weapon. That's not to say that it's only useful as a goofy, silly weapon though, as the loose cannon does have genuine standalone use cases that no other demo primaries share. For one, being able to manually detonate your bombs allows you to hit enemies around corners or behind cover with airburst explosives without sacrificing your sticky trap. This can be really effective for pestering enemies off of points or forcing them to engage, at which point you can fight them from a much more advantageous position one-on-one. It's basically Demo Man's equivalent to Pyro's detonator, being able to manually airburst projectiles whenever you may need. It's especially valuable due to not requiring any investment from your secondary, so you can keep stickies placed or have a fallback shield for an escape. On top of that, the ability to one-shot light classes is undeniably powerful. Non-instant kill weapons in TF2 that can one-shot are kind of few and far between, so being able to catch particularly aggressive flankers and overextending enemies off guard with a Hail Mary double donk is really satisfying. It's also a pretty effective flex, as it does genuinely require skill, positioning, and timing to pull off double donks consistently. 131 damage in a single projectile is nothing to scoff at, and with potentially 4 of them at your disposal at all times, you're rocking unlocking some pretty potent killing power. It takes some time to get into the groove, but once you start landing them, you'll never be able to look back. Lastly, for positives, and to call back to the namesake of this video, the knockback is genuinely incredibly helpful. I've had situations where I've effectively no-sold Ubers by just donking the shit out of the medic and his heal target to keep them at bay. Being able to displace enemies from a distance without placing yourself at risk, with the potential for huge chunks of damage or outright one-shots along the way, is unironically really huge. I can't say that the knockback comes into play for this weapon as much as it does the other two in this video, but it's still a helpful stat when it does come in clutch. However, the loose cannon does have some pretty noteworthy downsides that keep it from being a genuine contender within Demoman's primary slot at serious levels of play, and they mainly come down to its lack of raw damage against enemies that it can't one-shot. Against tankier classes, there's not really much you can do to outpace their damage, and in the event that they're still alive after a double donk, you're left incredibly exposed. The knockback is kind of a double-edged sword here, as hitting them with the initial donk likely knocked them out of range for a second one. Compare this to the reliable consistency of any other grenade launcher, which require at most 2 direct hit pipes to kill 8 of the game's 9 classes from full health. Also, this weapon really sucks at destroying sentries. You can't knock them back or double donk them, so you're left shooting 50 damage peanuts at them and hoping the explosive damage adds up enough to finish the job before the engineer can heal it off. But regardless of anything else, the loose cannon is just kind of a fun and very satisfying weapon. This is the TF2 equivalent to like that cool bachelor uncle everyone wishes they were. He's not entirely put together and kind of coasts along on hope and good vibes, but he's just so charming, fun, and well-meaning that everyone likes having him around. I'd be exaggerating if I called the loose cannon a great weapon. Its steep learning curve, bugs, gimmicky nature, and lack of consistency compared to stock kind of keep it from being anywhere near a serious contender. But it is very much a weapon I enjoy, and one that I would strongly advocate for earnestly getting good at. It brings such a unique flavor to the average TF2 match, and always manages to put a smile on my face when I use it. The loose cannon is not great, it's not terrible, it's just very, very fun. And that's what matters. Until I get Ubered and fumble all of my shots.
Burn to the ground! Burn to the ground! Burn to the ground! Burn!
And finally, we've arrived at what I'm sure will be the most popular and least controversial weapon in this video. The Scorch Shot. If you've never played TF2 or haven't had much exposure to this weapon, you'd probably be forgiven for looking at its stats and thinking absolutely nothing of it. What, it's a flare gun that knocks enemies back on hit and does like 20 damage. Big whoop, wanna fight about it? Doesn't seem like much. However, in practice, you'll come to find that the Scorch Shot is actually one of the most hated and widely contested weapons in the game. People despise the Scorch Shot. But why is that? What did this little gun do to earn such vitriol? Let's find out. Well, the Scorch Shot is an unlockable secondary for Pyro. A small flare gun with a different paint job than Pyro's other options, this weapon fires flares that deal 35% less damage than its alternatives and have 35% less self-knockback force on jump than the detonator. While these two stats might seem pretty damning, trust me, this weapon more than compensates. For one, its flares deal knockback to enemies on direct hit and explode upon impact with the ground, allowing it to do something similar to the detonator and double tap enemies with both a knockback direct hit and an explosion afterwards. On top of this, its knockback force and its damage are both amplified on burning players, with it dealing additional knockback and a guaranteed mini crit if you hit anyone who's on fire with it. On top of this, it'll explode when it touches the ground regardless of if it hit an enemy, allowing you to blind fire it in the general direction of enemies to ignite people with splash damage. This weapon also has a flat 60 afterburn damage or 75 with a mini crit and can destroy sticky bombs because it definitely needed that. So what you should have gathered from all that is that the Scorch Shot is an incredibly front-loaded weapon. While it does deal less damage, it's also a knockback weapon, a guaranteed mini-crit weapon, a fire damage weapon with a guaranteed 60 damage and afterburn, and an explosive weapon that can ignite multiple enemies at the same time and combo players with singular shots. Simply put, this thing does a whole lot for what's essentially just a differently painted flare gun. Gone are the days of carefully lining up flare punches and perfectly airbursting your detonator shots. The Scorch Shot does all of that for you and more with only one input. Starting from the top, the knockback is huge. It's basically what I said about the loose cannon being capable of no-selling enemies and displacing them from a distance, but applied to a much easier to land, faster, longer range, and more consistent projectile that also ignites enemies and doesn't explode after a set distance or time. The potential for a single well-placed shot to completely throw off an enemy's push is staggering, and if you can consistently land shots, you can basically stun lock someone as you rapidly strike them with what are essentially back-to-back direct hit into into explosive combos. This weapon's knockback is an incredibly versatile trait, and one that's only made stronger by its double tapping potential and amplified nature on burning enemies. You've basically got a long-range air blast that ignites people here. That's not to say that you even need to use the knockback or land direct hits though, as this weapon is also an explosive that ignites enemies for 60 afterburn damage, regardless of where the explosion hits them from. Because of this, blind firing shots in the general direction of enemies is incredibly effective, and even if you're not securing any kills, you're very effectively pestering and applying afterburn to enemies from a safe distance, with all of the usual trappings that come with both. Hell, you can actually still ignite people even after a direct hit on one of their teammates should they be caught in the explosion, so there's really no situation where you should have this thing equipped and not be constantly hammering away at enemies from a distance with it. And of course, this weapon deals guaranteed mini crits to burning players, which is also pretty multi-layered, as not only does it give this weapon the same combo utility as Pyro's other flare guns, but it also means that a direct hit into an explosive will reset the enemy's afterburn counter with a mini crit afterburn. This raises the damage from a guaranteed 60 over 7.5 seconds to 75, which when combined with this weapon's 20 base damage and lack of damage fall off, means that it does over 100 damage all said and done with full afterburn. This is, while not a one-shot on light classes, a gargantuan chunk of health to lose for being pecked by one long-range flare. The amount of times I've landed a scorch shot attack, died, and then saw a kill in the kill feed about 5 seconds later after I'd respawned is really criminal. Unlike the flamethrowers, which apply afterburn based on how long you've been directly attacking enemies for, a single hit from the scorch shot will always deal a guaranteed 60 or 75 unless stopped, which is extremely generous for such an easy to connect and safe weapon. Also, in case I didn't have enough reason to dislike this weapon, it also combos exceptionally well with the Phlogistinator. Due to its generous afterburn, safety, and long-range pestering, it allows you to very easily charge up your Phlog's meter while playing quite passively from a safe distance. Doing the math, it only takes 4 to 5 max afterburn durations on enemies to completely fill your Phlog meter, and that's assuming you've not done any additional fire damage nor connected any mini crits along the way. If you had, it'd be even faster. The Phlog rewards dynamically shifting between passive and aggressive playstyles based on whether or not you have your meter, and this weapon greatly facilitates it. And as a few additional positives, this weapon allows a pyro to perform a weakened flare jump, which while not nearly as effective as the detonators, can still allow you to reach some tricky locations and perform some very cheeky flanks. You can appear in places that people simply do not expect a pyro to. Also, for some baffling reason, this weapon can destroy sticky bombs, which is a trait otherwise reserved for hit scan weapons and Demoman's unlockable sticky launchers. Did this weapon really need that? Kinda feels like the other flare gun's 13 treason, doesn't it? So basically, this weapon does quite literally everything that you could ever want a flare gun on pyro to do. It sets enemies on fire, it explodes to make doing that easier, it combos both by itself and with other weapons, it deals extra damage to burning players, it knocks enemies back, it clears sticky traps, it allows you to jump, and most of all, it's incredibly safe. This weapon does all of this while not requiring the pyro to place himself anywhere near the front line or in the danger zone. This weapon does quite literally everything you could reasonably ask it to. Valve really front-loaded this weapon with every positive that a flare gun in this game could have. This is why it is so hated. While it does theoretically only offer weakened versions of the other flare gun strengths, it also has every other flare gun strengths in addition to its own unique mechanics. This is like one of those fighting game characters that has an amalgamation of every other character's movesets, except actually good. A single weapon should not be able to do all of this. And you want to know what's fucked up? Like, I mean really fucked up? I still use this weapon, and I'm sure you do too. You kinda have to. I realize how bullshit broken and annoying this weapon is, but it's like, why would you ever not equip it? Sure, you can't deal 90 damage flare punches, do crazy detonator jumps, or bring a shotgun or non-damaging utility, but it offers so much versatility and such a layered set of use cases for a single weapon. It lacks a generally specified niche, and rather just does everything that a pyro player could possibly ask a secondary to some extent. This is one of the best all-around general utilities that any class has access to in the game. While all of Pyro's other secondaries offer specialized use cases, this thing just kind of augments Pyro's abilities at a base. It's a jack of all trades. It's incredibly safe, versatile, annoying as hell for enemies, and is basically the best of every world for Pyro. I fucking hate the scorch shot, and I think it could very much do with a full rework, but I also know that not equipping it is handicapping myself. Why would I bring a more specialized utility when I have one tool that does it all? You know what they say, some people might want to watch the world burn, but a true maniac likes to watch the fireworks. Fuck this thing. So that was a deep dive into TF2's dedicated knockback weapons. Something you might have noticed is that outside of the Force of Nature, we didn't spend too long actually talking about knockback. And that's because, for some reason, Valve really likes front-loading these weapons. It's as if they view a tool that simply knocks enemies back as not being interesting or layered enough to commit more than one weapon design to, and as a result, they feel the need to really gild the lily with these types of items. In the case of the loose cannon, I'd say it worked really well. In the case of the scorch shot, not so much. And the Force of Nature is just kinda happy to be here. Regardless, considering the state of CC in games like Overwatch, I'm glad that Valve has played it generally safe with knockback in TF2. Always remember, things could have been a lot worse. Thanks, hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching. Thanks again to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video. Make sure to check them out using the link in the description below, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers!